I read a great piece last week in the Dallas Morning News by Joseph Hoyt, who joins us now. And Joseph, appreciate the time this morning. I watched this guy in 2017 make a game-saving tackle along with some other guys in the state championship. You've been covering him for quite some time. How long have you watched Hudson Clark make plays since he was in high school?
You know, it's funny. I got back to the Dallas Morning News. I interned in 2016 and got back in November of 2018. So this was actually only, into the November portion, obviously, of the high school football season. And it was Hudson's senior year. And my first game I covered him was against College Station. And he was just making plays. You kind of looked at Highland Park secondary, and as someone who hadn't really followed him in a while, I was like, that might be a weak point for him. I don't know. College Station's got some athletes, former state champion. But Hudson just, he would blow up wide receiver screens. He did it about 3 times. He made a couple deep pass breakups. And then after the game, I actually saw him talking with Chad Morris. And they were having a pretty kind of intense conversation, more than just hey, how's it doing? Good game. Obviously they were talking about something. And I talked to Chandler later, and that actually ended up being the first time that Chad kind of, propositioned the idea of, hey, like, we're really interested in you coming down to Fayetteville and being a walk-on for us. So it's funny how, but every time I've seen him since, and you go back and look at the resume and you watch the film, and he just consistently makes plays. And obviously he did against Ole Miss, now 2 weekends ago.
Kind of some standouts on that Highland Park team. Chandler Morris, obviously, at almost at Auburn. Good grief. Oklahoma now. Finn Corwin then is there as well. Finn Corwin is a preferred walk-on like Hudson is. Now Hudson getting that scholarship in January. Joseph, the question I have is that this guy had, it was either 8 or 9 interceptions his senior year. I know that you're going to tell us a story about Hud Island coming up, but why wasn't this guy offered on a back-to-back-to-back state championship team with the stats he had going up against the talented wide receivers that he did every week?
Ultimately it's one of those things you look back and you have to question. I talked with Cale Melton, who was his defensive coordinator, is now a head coach at Humble Kingwood, excuse me. And, he said that, hey, at Highland Park, college coaches will come knocking for quarterbacks, and they'll come knocking for offensive linemen, but they will not come knocking for skill players. He said it's a question that they had. It wasn't from a lack of sending out Hudson's film. It wasn't from a lack of coverage. I remember, distinctly talking with multiple reporters at the state championship game in 2018, when Hudson was just making plays. He had an interception in that game too, and it was just, you just wondered, how is this kid not getting looked at? I know the offseason going into his senior year, he did not go to recruiting camps. He played 7-on-7 for the Highland Park team, but did not go to recruiting camps. And he was always just committed to playing, doing everything he could for Highland Park. So there wasn't more of a selfish, hey, I'm going to take this weekend off and, from summer football practice and go, to this Adidas recruiting camp or, the 7-on-7 thing for a more, club kind of thing. He was just always committed to Highland Park. As evidence in some of the details I shared in my story. And, it's a big question mark. Obviously it's not like Highland Park is playing in against bad competition. I mean, these are some of the best players in the country. I included a list in my story of some of the players he went up against. And I mean, if you look at 2 of them last week, Marvin Mims from Oklahoma, just became the first 100-yard receiver Oklahoma's had this season. Mm-hmm. And then Jackson Smith-Najigba over at Ohio State made the catch of the year in game 1 of his college career. And Hudson had 2 interceptions against Rockwall and Jackson Smith-Najigba, and he held Marvin Mims, who ended up becoming the national leader for national leader for receiving yards in a season, and the career leader for receiving yards in Texas high school football history, to less than 100 yards and about 7 or 5 receptions. So, it wasn't from a lack of competition. It wasn't from a lack of ability. He can run a 4.6. He's above 6 foot tall. He was a little lanky back then, but obviously it's something that Arkansas is benefiting from now, that they were able to find him, kind of that diamond in the rough find.
We're speaking with Joseph Hoyt of the Dallas Morning News, wrote a fantastic article on Hudson Clark, kind of background on him. And for those who haven't heard, the origin of Hud Island is great. Joseph, for those who haven't heard this story, can you share it with us?
Yeah, it's funny. So throughout his senior season, there was a little cardboard drawing that kind of just emerged in the Highland Park student section. And, there's so many signs that kind of just end up, in student sections in high school football. But one of them just kind of kept appearing, and it was in all, caps and really drawn in, almost probably to the exhaustion of the point of the marker, was an HUD, and it was HUD. And then it was a little yellow, half circle, two palm trees, and then it said in the other, all caps, Island underneath. And you notice, you're like, oh, that's kind of a cool sign. Makes sense. Obviously in homage to Revis Island, Darrelle Revis, the former NFL standout.
Mm-hmm.
And the sign just kept showing up. And every time he made a play, you just see, whoever was holding it just extending two arms to the sky and holding this Hud Island sign. And next thing you know, when, he decides, hey, I'm going to Arkansas, and hey, I'm going to go play D1 football, all of a sudden the Hud Island sign appears behind him when he's signing with the Razorbacks. And it's funny, it just became a nickname for him, because he was so locked down, and he shut down an entire side of the field. If he was covering someone, they weren't going to get behind him. Obviously it was his own little island that's kind of now, emerged in Fayetteville as well. So
he's the 3 interceptions is evident of that. But he's not the only guy from Texas making plays, Joseph. You think about Bumper Pool from Lovejoy and Allen. You think about Jalen Catalan from Mansfield Legacy. How important have those guys been to the defense for Arkansas this year? And watching them in high school, when did you know that they were going to be worthy of a Division I scholarship?
Yeah, it's funny. So Jalen Catalan is a player. So like I said, I interned in 2016, and kind of the bane of the intern existence is doing this weekly Defensive Player of the Week. And long story short, it's because we keep our own offensive stats for the entire area, so that's pretty attainable. But for Defensive Player stats, we don't keep those. So it's all about nominations. And when I was an intern, I got a nomination about this true freshman or just freshman at Mansfield Legacy who set the record for tackles in his first season. And I was like, oh, that's obviously got to go to this kid. Ended up being Jalen Catalan. And, after I left my internship, you just kept following him. And when he was a sophomore, he was one of the best players in the state. I wrote a feature about him, and before he tore it, basically when he tore his ACL, it kind of robbed him of becoming one of the best players in Texas high school football history. He was that good. I know Randy Allen, the head coach at Highland Park, said that he's the best opposing player he's ever seen, ever. And coming from Randy Allen, if you know Texas high school football, that's about as high a praise you can get for a high school football player. So Jalen, it's funny when I was looking at Hudson, I was watching actually that game against Ole Miss, and you see Jalen making his pick six. You see Bumper Pool all over the field, this season, and you see Hudson with his 3 interceptions, and you kind of look and you're like, those are 3 guys that dominated Texas high school football. Jalen, was one of the best players, like I said, had a chance to go down. Bumper Pool was an absolute tackling machine at Lucas Lovejoy. And then Hudson, without the scholarship and stars and that kind of notoriety, quietly had 11 interceptions in 2 seasons against, some of the best players in the state while going on to win 2 state championships. So you kind of look at the pedigrees, and it makes sense that these are kind of the guys that are fueling a defense that is really impressing and doing really well in the SEC.
We're speaking with Joseph Hoyt of the Dallas Morning News here on the Morning Rush. Let's shift over to the offensive side of the football for Arkansas. Joseph, you look at Kendall Briles as the offensive coordinator, deep ties within Texas. Obviously, his dad was a legendary high school coach before becoming the Houston coach, then Baylor coach. What is his reputation with Texas high school football coaches, and how important is that going to be for recruiting offensive guys for Arkansas from the state of Texas?
Yeah, you mentioned his dad, obviously, was the former head coach at Stephenville. And I think, there's still a lot of connections to Art Briles here in Texas, and obviously he is now currently Texas high school football coach. So when it comes to recruiting in Texas, that's always the kind of the gateway to these players. It's what is the relationship like with their with their head coach in high school, and obviously with the crew recruiters. And I think, with Art Briles' history, and obviously Kendall being the son there, that there's obviously connections there. I mean, I remember actually talking with Chad Morris, who was, everyone loved him here in Texas high school football as well. And, it's all about relationships with these guys. I remember Chad would tell me that sometimes he'd go to schools that had no prospects he was interested in, and he would just, go on the whiteboard and draw up plays. And I think that that's what a lot of, coaches will do here. And that's a, great way to get players. I mean, and I'm assuming that Kendall Briles probably does the same thing. When you think of Kendall Briles, I think of a guy that obviously knows offense. And there's plenty of offensive players down here. I know Chase Lowry over at Frisco's coming, and I know Keytron Jackson from Roy City, who is our second. I mean, we do a Sports Day HS Top 100 area rankings for seniors every year, and he's our second ranked wide receiver in the entire area behind Quay Davis, who's going to USC. So that is an incredible pickup for the Razorbacks, and that's a guy that, we talk about Hudson playing early. We talk about Jalen playing early. That's another kid who I think could get on the field pretty early for Kendall Briles' offense. And I have no doubt that, Briles' capabilities as a coordinator intrigued Keytron and ultimately helped him commit there.
Yeah, Justin Stepp, a wide receiver coach at the University of Arkansas, has done a fantastic job of that. Joseph, you were mentioning great high school players, and kind of unfortunately, Jalen Catalon was kind of robbed of that with his senior year injury. One of the guys that I believe did not lose a single game in high school was Kyler Murray, and he was on display fully Monday Night Football against Russell Wilson, who is likely the MVP candidate in the NFL. What was it like to watch Kyler Murray in high school?
Yeah, so he's another guy that I ultimately did not get a chance to watch in high school, but it's funny because you just talk to people. And anytime you start talking about Texas high school football, and the first thing that comes up is Kyler Murray. Matt Wixon was a longtime columnist for us, and it's funny some of the conversations we get to have about him, and it's you hear about this guy, and the stories are just legendary. I mean, you talk to some of the coaches down here who were ultimately robbed of state championships or wins because of him. I think of Claude Mathis over at DeSoto, a pretty famous school. Reginald Samples over at Duncanville. But he was at Skyline over at the time. And these are guys that would have won state championships if not for the magic and legend of Kyler Murray. I even tweeted it after the Monday night game, and I was like, that game had a very Kyler Murray at Allen feel to it. And it's because you could never ever count that guy out. And it's not even because of an example. I mean, for example, there was weird, like an 8-yard onside kick that they recovered that everyone swears from Skyline and went 8 yards. Allen got the onside kick, and that helped fuel a crazy comeback in the state semifinal. And I kept thinking, like, well, if you look at, what happened with Seattle on Monday night, I mean, throwing the interception in overtime, some of the clock stuff that Larry Fitzgerald held, and ultimately it's some of these things that kind of happen, but it's Kyler Murray that ends up being the catalyst and the magician that ultimately helps him get these wins. And so I thought that was a very Kyler Murray at Allen-esque game. And you ask anyone down here and he's, they might have some biases about, players that they coached or players they played against, but ultimately, Kyler Murray is the best Texas high school football player that ever played.
Joseph Hoyt, Dallas Morning News. If you haven't read his piece on Hudson Clark and his family and kind of just the process that got him here, you need to. Joseph, really appreciate the time this morning, man. And again, fantastic article on Hudson Clark and his process.
Ty, thank you so much for having me, man. It was fun to write, and I'm sure Razorback fans are really excited to have Hudson there. So thanks again, Ty.
Absolutely. And Hudson Clark listed, and I know we can't necessarily verify with the depth chart, but he is listed as a starter this week, Jenkins, and that's something that we'll definitely get into a little bit here on a Toyota Tuesday.